maybe I give you some context about the next talk. I could talk a little bit about it. The next talk is about Angular and JavaScript. And it is to be more specific about structural directives, and structural directives start with this asterisk, with this star at the beginning. And I'm just waiting until the technicians give me the go that I can finally introduce the next speaker. So structural directives start with a star at the beginning. And let me introduce our next speaker, Ashnita. She aimed for the moon and she missed it and ended up in the stars. Let's welcome Ashnita on stage.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Michael. Let me just get started. Okay. So, hello everybody. I am really excited to be here and to be part of the very first NG Spain. I am going to talk to you about structural directives and specifically creating custom structural directives. Structural directives are not a new feature in Angular, but I feel that it is still quite nice to know what's in the tool set and to know a little bit about the building blocks of structural directives so that when the need arises, you're able to create your own. So we can easily recognize a structural directive with the asterisk in front of the directive name. The asterisk actually gives syntactic sugar. So the string assigned to the structural directive has a microsyntax. In the string, we declare the property bindings and the template input variables. Structural directives are actually designed to be used as attributes on the ng template directive. The ng template directive declares an embedded view. Embedded views are dynamic views that get created by the structural directive in this case. So the ng4 here implements the logic to create the embedded view, and we pass the ng4 off. We pass data to the ng4 directive using property binding. So the ng4 off property we're setting here with our books expression. And the ng4 directive also makes available the context property, object properties, which it provides for the embedded view when it creates it. So all these template input variable declarations and property binding makes the HTML code a little bit verbose. So Angular gives us the star syntax, the asterisk syntax, which is more concise and lets us write the HTML code in a more declarative way. So what we will cover today is views, a little look about views and dynamic views so that we can understand embedded views a little bit better, and the building blocks of structural directives, which are the TemplateRef and ViewContainerRef, so ng template and view containers, and a little bit about, we know about input property binding, but there's a little special input property binding rules for structural directives, so we'll look at that and we'll look at how the structural directive passes context to the embedded views. So let's start off with components and views. So components are our most basic building blocks of an Angular application. It is self-contained. It defines the view, the styles for the view, the data that gets displayed in the view, and the methods to handle the user interactions with the view. So what exactly is a view? A view is a set of HTML that gets created and destroyed together. It is what it gets rendered, it's what we see on the screen and what we interact with. And we define a component's view in its template. So the actual elements in the component template, the order they place, number of elements, it forms the structure of the component view. And we want to be able to dynamically change the structure by adding, removing, or moving the elements, directives in our component view. But we don't want to do DOM manipulation from our application code. We want to use the tools that Angular provides us for manipulating the component view. So what can we use? Dynamic views is what we can use to manipulate the component view. So dynamic views are basically defined in templates and created dynamically by our application code. There are two ways of defining dynamic views in Angular. One is with dynamic components, and the other is with embedded views. So how do we choose between dynamic components or embedded views? If we have a view that can be reused by other components in the application, we would define a dynamic component. But embedded views are more specific to a component's view. So, for example, if you want to render part of a view conditionally, based on a condition, it is going to be different view from one component to the view that another component wants to render conditionally. So embedded views are suitable when we want to render part of a view conditionally. So it's ngIf is the directive that Angular provides us that we use all the time. And the tool that Angular gives us to create dynamic views is the ViewContainerRef. It is a really awesome class provided in Angular core, which creates, renders, and manipulates the dynamic views. So what are structured directives then? Structured directives are the directives that implement the logic to create embedded views. So they use ngTemplate and the view container. So structured directives are reusable. They can be reused by different components in your application. They take away the implementation logic from the component on how to create the embedded view. Structured directives are also focused on just implementing the functionality and lets the user provide the view. So that gives quite a lot of flexibility for the user when implementing solutions that support the components. So let's have a look at the steps to create structured directives. We'll try and follow some example of a custom structured directive that we might create for ourselves. So let's say, oftentimes you might have components which has part of a view that you want the user only to see if they have a specific role. So we can create a custom directive, perhaps called has roles, for that. So we use very handy Angular CLI to create our directive. And we'll get a class which is decorated with the directive decorator and a single option for selector, which is the CSS attribute selector. And if you notice, the asterisk is not actually part of this of the attribute name. So far, this directive is not any different from an attribute directive. So the difference comes in how we implement it. So a structure directive needs the reference to the template, which defines the embedded view that needs to be rendered. And we can get that. So directives can access their host through dependency injection. So since ngTemplate is the host of the structure directive, it can access the template reference through dependency injection. So let's just have a little closer look at ngTemplates and TemplateRef at this stage. So as I mentioned earlier, ngTemplate is a directive provided by Angular, which lets us define a template within a component template. And the ngTemplate defines an embedded view. Embedded views are dynamic views that are defined but not rendered until they're created by our application code. We can create as many instances of the embedded view that we want and when we want. The ngTemplate, so in order to access ngTemplate from our application code, we need the TypeScript representation of it. So TemplateRef is a class that represents ngTemplate. It has got a simple API, and has got a property called elementRef, which is a reference to the actual ngTemplate element. The ngTemplate, so an instance of a TemplateRef would have in a private property called _dev, then element template .nodes, which is an array, which is where the embedded view definitions are kept. I know that's like implementation details, but that helped me to kind of really see that, yes, ngTemplateRef does hold a embedded view definition. And OK, so the create embedded view method is what the TemplateRef uses to actually instantiate an embedded view instance. And we can pass a context object to the embedded view. OK, so now we've got a reference to the template. So we, in our structure directive, so we know what embedded view to create. We need a way to know where to create this embedded view, where to insert it. So remember, the embedded views are going to be inserted into a component view. So we need a way to be able to know where exactly to insert this. So the ViewContainerRef API is what lets us do that. And again, we can access the ViewContainerRef through dependency injection. And I think this is quite clever how structured directives work, that they use the template, ngTemplate, as the default template, which is going to be rendered, as well as the view container, the anchor for the view container, saying this is where to render it. So in our dependency injection, we actually accessing the same ngTemplate twice. And this time, by giving the ViewContainerRef token, we get an instance of ViewContainerRef class. And so if you can imagine view containers as like this boat is anchored to the island by being tied to the tree, the view containers are anchored to the component view by the anchor element. So when we get an instance of the ViewContainerRef class, it creates a private property embedded views, which is where the views get that are created are kept. So that's the container part of it. So the container is implemented by this array. And the methods create component is to create a dynamic view. It will get the dynamic view definition will get added to the embedded views array, and the create embedded view method creates an instance of an embedded view. So as we saw just earlier, the TemplateRef API also has got a create embedded view method. So this is something that kind of confused me in the start. Why are there two create embedded view methods? Like, I hadn't seen the TemplateRef create embedded view used in examples, but the ViewContainerRef create embedded view used to actually create the embedded views. So what happens is that the ViewContainerRef create embedded view actually calls the TemplateRef embedded view to create an instance of the embedded view. It returns a reference to an embedded view ref class. And then it calls, the ViewContainerRef calls its insert method, which is where it adds it to the embedded views array and also adds it to the component views definitions and calls the appropriate methods to render the view. So, okay, so we have got methods to clear the view, which will remove all the dynamically created views by this instance, or to remove an individual one. We can query it using get and index of. And another important thing to mention here is that the element property is what references to the anchor element, so that the view container will know where to render the dynamically created views. And in a structured directives case, the anchor is the ng template. So this is hopefully a more sort of visual representation of what, once the component gets rendered, we might see. So the H1 will get rendered, and then ng template will be rendered as a comment. And then if we can imagine like a virtual container, which is where all the dynamically created views by this view container instance gets created. So like in the ng4 case, there will be many instances of the embedded views. So the container can be however long the number of items are in the list, or there may just be one item. It can be a mixture of dynamic views, dynamic components, and embedded views. Both of them will end up in the same container. And when manipulating the views, it's that container that gets manipulated. So, okay, so now how do we pass data to the structural directive? The same as with components and with attribute directives, we use property binding. The important thing to note about input property names for structured directives is that structured directive input property names start with the attribute, the directive attribute name. So in our case, we have app has role directive. So all the input properties should be prefixed with app has role. Okay, and the second thing to note. Okay, so the second thing to note is that it is a common pattern that directives use to name an input property the same as the directive attribute name, which allows us to define to declare the directive as well as bind to its input property at the same time. And when we do that, in the microsyntax, using the the asterisk syntax, the first expression will be the property binding. So here, customer is actually binding to the app has role input property. And we have the other input property binding here, which is else, and then else ref. So that's a reference to the ng template, which provides an alternative view. If the user does not have a role, you could render that view. So when desugared, that asterisk syntax will be, so the compiler will wrap the root element into an ng template directive. It will place the structural directive and its property bindings and its input template variables declarations onto the ng template tag. The other thing to note here is that any class or styles or other directives like attribute directives that were on the root element will still remain on the root element. So it's only the things in the microsyntax in the string that's assigned to the structural directive that gets moved to the ng template. Okay, so now we've passed the data to structural directives. How does the structural directive share its state and the methods that it wants to expose to the embedded view? It uses the context object. So when creating the embedded view, the structural directive can pass a context object whose properties will have the state and the methods that the structural directive wants to make available to the embedded view. So in our example, has role probably does not have much state to share with the embedded view. There isn't much the embedded view would want to know about, the context. So, but we could expose the role back to the embedded view. But to look at context objects a little bit closer, I'll switch to another directive, which is a carousel, a custom directive, structured directive for carousel. So the carousel directive would get a list, an array as an input, and it would expose the current item that is being displayed, and also the controls to move to the next item and the previous item as part of the context. We defined template input variables on the ng template to access these context object properties. And there are two, in the microsyntax, the string that we assign to structural directive, with the asterisk syntax, there are two ways to declare template input variables. One is using the let keyword, and the other is using the as keyword. So it's kind of reversed. So with the let, you say local variable equals and the context property name. With the as, you say context property as local variable. Okay, so that's an example of how of the carousel. So we've declared the current item being displayed. So let book from books, and then control as control. So what's happening here? Can you kind of like recognize the property binding side part of this and the template in the variable declarations here? So from books is the property binding, and the let book and control as control are the template input variable declarations. The embedded view is defined using HTML and directives, the same as how we define component views. So we can have property bindings, we can have interpolation, we can have event binding. Okay, so I've done that. Okay, desugared. The let and as both get desugared to let dash, then the variable name, and then assign the value to it. And one important thing to mention about context objects is the $implicit property. So if you notice, we have declared a variable book, but we haven't assigned a value to it. So how does book get its value? It gets its value from $implicit property. So whenever we declare a variable without assigning a property name to it, it's $implicit property that gets assigned to that variable. Okay, so it is also a really good idea to create a type for the context object property, for the context object, sorry. And we can use, when we create a embedded view, we pass in the context, and it takes an argument for the context object types, rather. And we can use either a interface or a class, whichever your preference is. The Angular built-in directives use class. For example, the ng4 uses class, and then it has the use of the constructor and the getters to define the context object properties. Okay, so then we are at the final stage where we can actually implement the logic. And the code might look something like this, and I've simplified it just to fit it in. So you'd have the structured directive is implemented by a controller class, so we can inject a service to it. So we might inject a role service, and we check with it to see if the role includes the role we wanted, and to create the embedded view if we want to actually create this view. Okay, so I want to actually give credit to the Angular in-depth community. Alexei wrote quite a bit about how the ng4, like the parser, works with the microsyntax, etc. on Stackblade. So I asked him I got help from him to understand how the microsyntax actually works in the code. And I think I have a little bit time, so to actually finish off, I would do some live coding to actually create the carousel structural directive. So are you able to see this code from the back? Okay. So to put in practice what we've been hearing about, let's create the carousel structural directive. So first of all, I will define the context type, and I'll use the interface, I'll use interface for that. Export interface. So context directive, carousel directive context, and I want to be able to type the actual context. So I will assign $implicit, which will be the current item that is being displayed by the carousel. And then I want to expose the controls to move the between the items. So I have an object which will have the next method and a previous. Okay. So I've put notes here so I won't forget. So if you do see me making a mistake or see if I forgot something, please help me out. So the next thing, I want to get hold of the template reference and the view container reference. So private TemplateRef, the type would be TemplateRef, and I want to give the type of the context, object context that I just created, and the implicit property. So I've got the TemplateRef. Now I want to get the ViewContainerRef, so private ViewContainerRef, which is of type ViewContainerRef. And this will give me instances of the ng template, which will have the carousel directive on it. So 2, 3. Now I want to declare, I want to keep record of what's currently been displayed. So index will start off being 0. And I need to create an input property so that we can pass the list of items that we want to display in the carousel. And as I mentioned, the input properties have to start with the structure directive attribute name. And this is where I can define, like, when you're creating your own structure directive, you can define the sort of grammar. So I could say, let an item off items for the ng4 directive. The off is being created by the ng4 directive as what. So I could use something similar to that, since we are used to using the ng4 directive. Okay, and then I would actually create, so assign the context equals, make the first item. So implicit will be this dot index. Okay, and then I need to expose the controls, which will have next and return a function, this dot next, and the previous. Okay. Okay. So to save a bit of typing, I have got code to implement that from earlier, so hopefully this works.
There's a typo.
Is there? Oh, thank you ever so much. Who was that? Thank you. Is that? Ah. Okay. Okay, so I'll create this dot create embedded view. So this is the actual function to create now pass in the TemplateRef and the context. I still have a mistake somewhere. Oh, hang on. I have not defined context. Okay, so I can type it by putting okay. have I got everything? All right, so I'm trying to rush here. So we can... So I'm just gonna reuse this code. Okay, that works. So this is, so okay, I'll just explain, sorry. Thank you. I had to rush because the time's up and I'm going over time. But okay, so here's the app carousel directive in applied, and the grammar that I created in the directive. I'm saying declaring and I'm declaring a template input variable and binding to the input property, and I've got the event handlers to go to use the methods to go to previous and next. So thank you ever so much for listening and for helping me out, and that's all from me.